Perhaps it is that encoding in your DNA. There are genetic SNPs that predispose certain people to things like depression. There are genetic SNPs that predispose others to anxiety and being more susceptible to stress. There are genetic SNPs that predispose people to having a compromised detoxification system, which can lead to imbalances within your hormones because your liver is not able to properly rid itself of excess hormones, and that can affect your sexual intimacy. So it is important that we look at genetics, mental, emotional, physical, spiritual. Perhaps it is part of your spiritual DNA. Somehow, that journey was not placed into your being as you were brought up. Your understanding of your connectedness with others and your connectedness with the Supreme Being was somehow programmed in a way that isn't in alignment to make you be able to truly give yourself in intimacy. In any case, my question is, what is part of your DNA? I want you to think for a moment, and you can either write it on your paper, or if you are courageous enough to discuss it with someone next to you. What could be part of your DNA, whether it be your emotional DNA, your mental DNA, your physical DNA, your spiritual DNA, that could possibly affect your ability to have deep intimacy with another person? And then the other thing that we look at is, it's not just about your DNA or your genetics. Because just because you grew up in a certain household where perhaps your father was cold and distant or your mom was abusive, that does not necessarily mean that that is going to be your legacy. And then you have the reverse. Perhaps you grew up in a loving home, but that does not necessarily mean that that is your reality. Perhaps you do have one of those genes that impacts your liver pathways for detoxification. But now the question is it expressing itself? What is actually happening in your life? So one of the things that we do is that we assist the people that we work with in doing metabolic assessments. Now, the metabolic assessments come in many different forms. This is just the first form, which is a subjective survey. And what I'd like to have you look at this point in time, on the flip side, Roman numerals 17, 18, 19, and 20. The first two are for men, the second two are for women. The first 19 is for menstruating women, and 20 is for menopausal women. I want you to take a moment to identify how much symptomology do you see in your person with regards to these questions. Now, one of the things that you look for is, do you have a lot of symptomology in these areas? These are the areas that relate to hormonal balance within men and women, but not limited to that. Meaning that hormonal imbalances can be seen in other aspects of this particular assessment. But when I do an assessment with people, this is one of the areas that I have them look at first, because it just gives us a broad overview. Okay? And when we look at the assessments, then it gives us an idea of whether or not we need to do some further testing. Because the other side of this is that we can get really scientific about identifying imbalances. On the back table, you'll have pamphlets that give you information with regards to 2 different types of hormonal testing that I like. There is the saliva hormonal testing that is done with diagnostics, and then there's something called the Dutch test, dry urine test, complete hormones. What I love the most is the Dutch test, because the Dutch test not only tests the hormones, but it also, meaning the sex hormones, it also tests your stress hormones. A lot of times there's a big correlation between your stress hormones and your sex hormones. In fact, I was working with a gentleman just recently who came again because he had low libido, very young guy. Initially, I said, man, for sure this guy has low testosterone, because interestingly enough, we have studies that show that the testosterone levels have been decreasing significantly over time for our men. Subsequently, I said, it must be low testosterone. But something in me said, Michelle, doesn't quite feel right. Let's do this test. We did the Dutch test, and interestingly enough, his testosterone is through the roof. However, because this test also shows what's called the metabolites, it breaks down how the hormones are actually being metabolized in the body. So it breaks down your testosterone into different types of testosterone, into the weaker testosterone and the stronger testosterone. And like I said, it also shows us the stress hormones. So with this particular gentleman, what was keeping him from having that juicy, yay, get up and go, especially for a 25-year-old, you'd think, hey, they should be like horny little toads, right? But no, he's like, I don't care, you know. In his case, what was happening is that the pathway for the weaker testosterones were extremely elevated, and the stronger testosterone that helps in that manifestation of libido was very much decreased. In addition to that, his stress hormones were off the roof. So what was happening is that a lot of the resources were going from his sex hormone pathway into his stress pathway. And that, again, leads to the loss of libido. Remember, we talked previously about that connection between stress and having that, ooh, I want to have sex kind of thing. If you're stressed out, guess what? Your system is like, heck to the no, we ain't trying to make babies, we're trying to run away from the lions and tigers and the bears. That's exactly what it says. That's why it's very important to not just simply look at little assessments, but to actually get the testing done, right? And then in addition to that, we look at mentally. We start to have assessments. I have people sit down and do different assessments in terms of what are the thoughts that they have when presented with a situation for intimacy. Because a lot of times we're not even aware sometimes of what our thoughts are. We just know, I don't feel like it. And that is a critical part, to actually step back and pay attention to what the thoughts are. Because those thoughts get in the way, literally. And then to look at what is it that I'm feeling. Perhaps, maybe it's not so much that I don't want to be intimate with my husband, or I don't want to be intimate with my wife, but rather that I'm afraid that we're going to lose the house. Or perhaps, as I said in my situation, my person kept looping back to a previous experience. And that was what was shutting everything down. So the assessments on a personal level are very, very critical. Because guess what? When we come into a relationship, it's not just a relationship. There's you and there's me. So I've got to deal with my stuff. Because my stuff is going to impact what kind of stuff we can have together. In addition to the personal assessments that we do, we encourage people to look at their relationship assessments. We call it the State of the Union. On your papers, I want you to take a moment to reflect and consider, what is your sexual intercourse thermometer? Are you hot and spicy? Are you mild? Or are you just like, the fire is out, ain't no salsa here at all? Okay. What is your sexual intercourse thermometer? How hot is it in your relationship? And then we look at the mental aspect. Do you believe? And we ask both people this, so this is something that you can ask your mate when you go home. Do you believe that your 7 most basic needs are being met? Because the reality is that it's not important if the other person thinks that they are being met. It's about what you believe, okay? And